One of the problems with recruiting for investment banking is not the knowledge or skills you acquire, but the access to talk with real investment bankers to put your best foot forward. Our sponsor, WSO Academy, can provide those connections with 60 head mentors who are finance professionals at top firms like Goldman, Centerview, and JP Morgan. Imagine being able to get on the phone within 24 hours with one of the Academy's 1,300 mentors right before a critical interview. Get on the waitlist for WSO Academy today by clicking the link in the show notes or by visiting wallstreetoasis.com/academy. All right. Welcome to Investment Banking Insights, the only podcast dedicated to helping you learn both the technical and non-technical aspects of the investment banking process. Hey there, my name is Alex Mason and I am your host. Thank you so much for listening. We're going through all of these technical concepts right now. We're covering all the basics. We've gone through a lot of different sections and we are now at the tail end of the fundamental basics that you need to know for discounted cash flow. Isn't that amazing that we made it through all of this together? I just think that's incredible that we've learned so much in such a short period of time too. And so this question is about DCFs, discounted cash flows, and it relates specifically to this concept of debt. We know that companies often, almost always, have some debt on their balance sheet and they borrow it, they pay it off, they borrow it, they pay it off, they refinance. It's kind of this ongoing cycle for most companies, especially larger corporations that typically have a lot of capital and need a lot of capital in order to function well. So the question today is this: how do you account for high debt load and debt payoff in a discounted cash flow analysis? So how would you account for this? Let's say a company has a high debt load and they are paying that debt off quickly. How is that reflected in a DCF model? Interesting question, right? Kind of something a little bit different for you today. Well, let's think about the components of what a discounted cash flow model is. And remember, I'm going to keep repeating these concepts over and over because that's how we learn, is through repetition, right? So let's think about the components of a DCF. Well, we start with the revenue, and then we work our way down to free cash flow. And remember the financial statements that we covered in the accounting section of the show? Well, this all happens on the income statement, right? We work our way from the revenue all the way down to net income. But remember, net income is not the same thing as free cash flow. It's a little bit different. So how do we go from net income to free cash flow? Well, we have to adjust it on the cash flow statement. So we look at the cash flow statement, and on the cash flow from operations section, that's where we get to cash flow. And remember, you can take your cash flow from operations and subtract capital expenditures, and that is your free cash flow, your levered free cash flow, so to speak. Now, let's pivot our thinking to debt and debt payoff. So how does this work? When a business pays down debt, where does that show up in the financial statements? Well, remember, we've covered this stuff already, right? We've covered this, and we know that when a business pays down debt, that shows up in the cash flow from financing portion of the cash flow statement. It's captured in a different part of the financial statements than free cash flow, and therefore it is not reflected in a DCF model. See, this is kind of a trick question, because when you're paying off debt as a company, that cash flow from financing section is being affected. But remember, free cash flow, you could just take your cash flow from operations, subtract CapEx, which remember, CapEx is found in the cash flow from investing section of the cash flow statement, and boom, you have free cash flow. That has nothing to do with the cash flow from financing section there at the bottom of the cash flow statement. So kind of an interesting comparison here. There's these different parts of the cash flow statement working, showing different things that are happening, but this debt payoff is not reflected in the DCF model. However, it's not directly impacting the DCF model, but there is a connection here. That's important to make a distinction. So when it comes to levered free cash flow, it is reflected. Debt payoff is reflected because as debt gets paid down, say the company's paying off debt, their cash flow from financing section is changing. What happens when you pay off debt? Well, the interest expense of a company decreases, right? And so if your interest expense decreases, you would see this reflected in the amount of levered free cash flow available to the equity holders of the company. Because remember, levered free cash flow accounts for interest expense. Remember, we're not talking about unlevered free cash flow for a moment, but levered free cash flow accounts for this. And therefore, because that interest expense is changing over time, you would see an impact to your free cash flow changing over time because the debt is being paid off. So a little bit of a wrinkle there, but an interesting one, I think. So that is fundamentally the answer. When a company is paying off debt, it doesn't affect free cash flow because it's in the cash flow from financing section of the financial statements compared with the other two sections of the cash flow statement. Cash flow from operations minus CapEx equals free cash flow. It doesn't touch it. However, levered free cash flow is affected over time as debt is paid off because interest expense goes down. And that's what I got for you today, my friend. This has been Investment Banking Insights, and I hope you have enjoyed all of these discounted cash flow questions. And we're going to come back to this. Don't worry. If you feel like you've gone through all of these one time and there's still some questions lingering about the basics of discounted cash flow, we are going to revisit this when we come back and do some more advanced questions. And so we'll get to it. We'll come back to it. But congratulations. We've gone through discounted cash flow, the basic section, and I'm excited to introduce some new topics in the next episode. All right. I'll see you over there.